and him cross Delaware and fighting and beating all this other crap they teach our children in these public schools and these things that our society upholds. But, that's just, once you scratch beneath the surface, the reality of the truth is clear. And that's connected directly to what's going on right now with modern day slavery. Once you scratch beneath the surface of, don't do crime and you won't go to jail. And you look at the fact that nearly 5,000 new laws have been written and put on the books in the last few years even. The continuing hyper-criminalization of American citizenry overall so that the slave machine can continue to be fed. That's just below the surface of making silly statements like, well, just don't commit crime. So we'll move on to the number 5 fact that you never knew. The slaves at the Mount Vernon practiced diverse religious traditions and customs. So, obviously, there is some tradition that came over from the lands where the slaves were taken from. And there were some religious beliefs and practices that people came here with, obviously. And I guess he was a good guy because he allowed them to continue some of that stuff. So let's look at this. Influences from both African and European religious practices can be found amongst Mount Vernon's enslaved population. Some slaves at Mount Vernon participated with local organized Christian congregations to some degree. Also, Mount Vernon's enslaved community developed at least one spiritual leader from within their own community named Caesar. It's like straight out of Planet of the Apes, damn. According to a runaway slave advertisement from the spring of 1798. So a runaway slave got away and told them all about how Caesar had told him to get free. Further, the enslaved population at Mount Vernon had contact with at least 3 other Christian denominations, Baptists, Methodists, and Quakers. There were also several remnants of religious traditions from Africa continuing to some degree at Mount Vernon, including both Voodoo and Islam. So, there you have it. He was a free-thinking man. As long as you did the work and remained a slave, I suppose you could practice Christianity, whether Baptist or Methodist or Quaker. You could practice Islam, or if you want to be into that dark religion from the dark continent. Oh my goodness. So this is the justification. This is at the mountvernon.org website. This is his legacy website. This is what introduces people to who he is as our first president and one of our greatest leaders. This is the rhetoric that people are exposed to. So, again, this is why the Abolitionist Day is live and on air right now, and is going to be on day to day to spread the propaganda to counteract foolishness like this, to tell you the real story of what's going on and what happened and how we got here, as opposed to just allowing it to go unchecked. Because you see where our country is at right now, and the country seems to overwhelmingly believe that slavery was abolished. We have clear proof that it was not. And they seem to believe overwhelmingly that these were good people and take their families to Mount Rushmore to see the busts and take their families to D.C. to see all the monuments. And I mean, this is a wonderful vacation and a trip to be remembered for life and an inspiration for our youth to go see these monuments and see where these great men laid their heads and made their claim to fame and all this other crap. This is where these people held slaves and built a fortune off for the backs of African ancestors. But we'll move on. So, number 6, on numerous occasions, slaves ran away from the Washington household in an attempt to gain their freedom. Vernon's enslaved community took opportunities when possible to physically escape their enslavement. Imagine that. As good as the first forefather of America was treating them. As much as he let them worship their gods and worship his new god he gave them, and to go back and forth as they please or whatever, or at the threat of being shipped out of the country if he didn't like what they were doing. Imagine that these people actually had the nerve to want to escape to gain their freedom. Says Mount Vernon's enslaved community took opportunities when possible to physically escape their enslavement. For example, in April of 1781, during the American Revolution, 17 members of the Mount Vernon enslaved population, 14 men and 3 women, fled to the British warship HMS Savage, which was anchored in the Potomac off the shore of the plantation. So there's Washington's plantation right there on the shore of the Potomac. So he had himself set up well, man. In other instances, members of the enslaved community who were directly connected to the Washingtons either attempted to or were successfully in their escape plans. These individuals included Washington's personal assistant, Christopher Shields, whose plan to escape with his fiancée was thwarted. The family cook Hercules, and Martha Washington's personal maid, Oni Judge, both of whom escaped successfully. So, this is where we've scratched just beneath the veneer, just beneath the glossy, pretty surface of our great forefather president, who had his portrait created on several occasions with the teeth of his slaves. They don't have this on the list of how he snatched the teeth out of his slaves' mouths and had them put in his own mouth. So if you just think about the savagery of something like that, that's what the country's built on. Number 7, slaves at Mount Vernon also resisted their enslavement through less noticeable means. Oh, imagine that. Good Negroes who didn't run away, they just passively resisted, kind of like they want us to peacefully resist and protest today, I suppose. Running away was a risky venture that often did not succeed. As a result, Mount Vernon's enslaved population frequently resisted their bondage through a variety of methods while working on the plantation. I mean, that is exactly like what is going on right now. Exactly what we're seeing coast to coast in the protests, the die-ins, the hands up, don't shoot, walking around with signs telling people to stop. Black Lives Matter. Lives matter. Muslim lives matter. Stop killing us. Stop beating us. Stop raping us when we do end up in prison. Stop making us slaves. Now, I won't get into how passive or protesting or whatever is wasting all of our time. Let's just stick to the story here. I'm sorry. Individuals utilize less notable methods of resistance, including feigning illnesses, malingering, working slowly, producing shoddy work, or in misplacing or damaging tools and equipment. I bet that used to piss him off. Damn it, you're tearing up my tools, tearing up my equipment. I know you ain't sick. See, at this time, the medical field was still pretty young in America. And they actually had this as medical theory that slaves could work harder and longer and under the most incredibly horrible conditions beyond what any other human beings on the planet could do. So it really was no sick day for a slave. So, being happy when they would pretend like they're sick. This reminds me of that Boondocks episode when they talked about Catcher Freeman and the version of the story that they tried to tell at first. Uncle Ruckus tried to tell, like the slaves were just so lazy and would not get to work and just resisted the master and mocked him and made jokes and made him look silly or something. I mean, this is ridiculous. As if these people could get away with feigning it. How the hell do you feign illness and you a damn slave? Anyway, theft was a particularly frequent act of visible slave resistance. So now we got the history of looting. Right here, they're telling you, theft. Of course, people were starving to death. Of course, people were wearing burlap for a shirt and nothing else until they became of adulthood in some kind of burlap pants or something and a shirt. No shoes in a lot of cases. All through the winter with frostbit toes or whatever. But they were using theft as a way to resist slavery. Wow. Over the years, slaves at Mount Vernon were accused of stealing a wide variety of objects, including tools, fabrics, yams, raw wool, wine, rum, milk, butter, fruits, meats, corn, and potatoes. Damn, they got a list, don't they? They know exactly what them slaves stole. So this is all things that used to mess up George Washington's day. Damn it, I come home and you slaves have been stealing fabric again. Number 8, in December of 1775, Washington, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, received a letter from Phyllis Wheatley containing an ode written in his honor. You, Phyllis. Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved woman brought to Boston from West Africa at just 7 years of age. Uncommon for practices at the time, Wheatley received instruction in subjects ranging from Greek, Latin, poetry, from the daughter of her owners. By age 12, Wheatley began writing poetry, and by 18, she had become well known for the publication of an elegy she wrote commemorating the death of a prominent preacher. In the winter of 1775, Wheatley sent Washington a letter containing an ode to the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. The poem concluded, quote, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine. With gold unfading, Washington, be thine." Wow. Washington responded kindly to Wheatley in a letter, the only known missive that he wrote to an enslaved individual. So see, this is what's so good about George Washington. Though he struggled with slavery for nearly 60 years of his adult life, he did put it in his will to let all those slaves go. And at one point in his life, he really didn't have to worry. He didn't even have to consider it. But, in the middle of the Revolutionary War and in the midst of all the hubbub and the press, he took the time out to write a letter to this poor slave girl. And the letter's called Miss Phyllis. An unusually polite way for a member of the gentry to address a slave. He called her Miss Phyllis. Very similar to modern day clowning that goes on in our society, but I won't try to stay on point. So Washington invited Wheatley to call on him at his headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In March of 1776, Washington courteously received Wheatley's visit. Given Washington's status as a slaveholder, their meeting was an early instance of the progression of racial understanding in antebellum America. Man, this guy, he was amazing. What better person to have as our president, a good all-around guy like this. Number 9, with little free time and control over their everyday life, Mount Vernon's enslaved population attempted to exert some free will and choice when it came to their private lives. Damn it, these slaves said if we slaves, we still gonna be free somehow. You can't stamp out the light of us having a good time. Cause black folks always find a way to have a good time. Mount Vernon's enslaved community usually worked a 6-day week, with Sunday generally being the day off for everyone on the plantation. On a daily basis, in addition to their day's work, slaves had their own housekeeping work, such as tending the chickens and tending their garden plots and doing their little bit of cooking and making preserves and caring for their clothes and their extensive wardrobe. They had to keep that up, stay with the trends, Shout out to Kanye. With precious little free time and control over their own schedules, slaves at Mount Vernon attempted to exert some control over their personal lives. Some slaves at Mount Vernon spent their free time can't even believe I'm reading those words. Some slaves at Mount Vernon spent their free time, what the hell, visiting with one another. In some instances, slaves visited other plantations where their spouses lived. It was no big deal. Your wife lived 20 miles away and you had to walk both ways and you had to be back before a certain hour. You'd be hung. Good life. Some even used their time to play games and sports. A visitor to Mount Vernon during the summer of 1798 described what may have been a team sport played by slaves on Sunday. Oh my God. The visitor from Poland recorded witnessing a group of about 30 slaves divided into two groups playing a game he described as quote-unquote prisoner's base, which involved jumps and gambles as if they had rested all week. Moving on to number 10. Because see, what's not going to happen on this program is I'm not going to start my famous rants. I'm going to be under control on this program, Scotty Reed. I'm going to handle myself on this program. I'm going to stick to the facts. I'm not going to start all that extra ranting and raving. So what would be the point? I'm here to give you the history right now, then we'll get into the news right after this. Number 10, George Washington left instructions in his will for the emancipation of his slaves upon the death of Martha Washington. This is his crowning achievement. Washington wrote his will several months before his death in December 1799. In the document, Washington left directions for the eventual emancipation of his slaves after the passing of Martha Washington. Of the 318 slaves at Mount Vernon in 1799, 123 of the individuals were owned by George Washington and were eligible to be freed as per the terms of his will. However, these conditions did not apply to all slaves at Mount Vernon. By law, and remember, even today, President Barack Obama, our first truly African and American president, has reminded us, in the face of all this unexplainable Black Death, in the face of all of this hyper-criminalization and imprisonment and enslavement, abuse, on and on, what's going on, systematic terrorization of people of color in this country, the domestic colony known as African Americans. He reminds us that this is a nation of laws. And even in Ferguson, when the riots started, as they call them riots, Ferguson Spring, Assistant Attorney General of the state of Missouri came out and made a statement to remind us that this country is a nation of laws. And these laws are founded on a long tradition of Anglo-American ordinances that we adopted. And we have to stick to them. And we had to stick to them in 1799. Even though the first president, said he wanted these slaves freed by law, they could not be made free. So when Martha Washington died in 1802, these individuals became property once again of the Custis estate and were divided among the grandchildren. By 1799, 153 slaves at Mount Vernon were a part of that property. In accordance with the state law, George Washington stipulated in his will that elderly slaves or those who were too sick to work were to be supported by his estate in perpetuity. Damn fine master. The remaining non-dower slaves at Mount Vernon did not have to wait for Martha Washington's death to receive their freedom. This creates a little rift, doesn't it? Because you come from a different owner, now you get free and I'm still here. I imagine they probably all would have liked to have been able to leave. Writing on the subject to her sister, Abigail Adams explained that Martha Washington's motives were largely driven by self-interest. In the state in which they were left by the general to be free at her death, Adams explained, she did not feel as though her life was safe in their hands. Those damn black terrorists, scary black people. With the president dead, when George died, how could she risk having all those thugs? All those animals around her? She had to get rid of them. She was doing it out of self-interest, her sister said. She didn't want to leave her life in their hands. Many of them believed, according to her sister, Abigail Adams, that it was in their interest to get rid of her. So she was advised to set them free at the end of the year. In December 1800, Martha Washington signed a deed of manumission for her deceased husband's slaves, a transaction that is recorded in the abstracts of the Fairfax County, Virginia court records. They finally became free January 1, 1801.